You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is Wednesday, October 29th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. First, we want to announce that a new edition of Dr. Horne's book entitled Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism in Crisis, is available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website. Blows Against the Empire was originally published in 2008. This new edition of Blows Against the Empire includes a new introduction by Dr. Horne updating this classic text. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Before we go a step further, let me refresh our collective recollections about why we do this program every week. It bears reiteration. That is to say that the correlation and balance of forces domestically in the United States oftentimes are hostile to the Black liberation movement and revolutionary forces generally, forcing us historically to rely on global allies. And so we do this news roundup about global events to try to keep us up to speed about the global correlation of forces, which has been so important to progress domestically. That is to say, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, igniting a general crisis of the entire slave system, resolved with that system's collapse in the United States in 1865, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the aid that it gave to decolonizing Africa and the Caribbean, igniting and accelerating liberation movements, which took flight in particular in the 1950s. Coincidentally enough, that's when the anti-Jim Crow movement as well took flight, and that was not coincidental. And so we also say that settler colonialism, this system under which we labor, is grounded in class collaboration amongst European descendants. And that also contributes to this hostile balance of forces domestically. The unpaid sector of the working class, which is another name we can affix to enslaved Africans, has oftentimes had interests diverging from those of the working class as a whole. In my book, Capital of Slavery, I talk at length about the War of 1812, when the Black population joined the British redcoat invaders in torching Washington, D.C., fleeing to freedom on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. That was not necessarily the universal sentiment amongst the working class as a whole, although I should also add that many Native Americans as well allied with the Redcoats during the War of 1812. And we should also realize something that was noted in the current issue of the New York Review of Books, this hoity-toity publication out of Manhattan, which points out something that I'm afraid to say that some of our friends on the left have chosen to ignore, which is that anti-Blackness has been an essential component of the rise of republicanism, anti-monarchism, which of course is celebrated in this country, not to mention capitalism and the Enlightenment itself. That is to say that per the New York Review of Books, they quote these disgusting, disparaging remarks about these leaders of the Enlightenment, speaking of Immanuel Kant and David Hume and Voltaire, making really disgusting remarks about Black people, but that's par for the course. And as I pointed out in my book on 1776, which I'm afraid to say has somehow been ignored by the critics of that text, 1776 was preceded by the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, once again clipping the wings of the monarch a la 1776. And in 1688, of course, that led to a triumph of merchant capital who descended like crazed bees into Africa, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight. In other words, the clipping of the wings of the monarch led directly to an enhancement of the African slave trade and anti-blackness as a rationale. And that same process, I'm afraid to say, beset North America post 1776. And even if you look at the French Revolution, and I take my hat off to the French Revolution to the extent that it contributed to abolition in 1794, but keep in mind that soon thereafter, Napoleon came to power, who styled himself as an executioner of the Haitian Revolution. And if you go to the Activist News Network, and you should be able to pull up an interview I just did on KPFK on the aforementioned program Freedom Now with the University of Denver scholar, speaking of Adam Rovner, who points out that in the Jewish diaspora, particularly in Europe, Napoleon was seen as a kind of quasi-messianic figure. I can guarantee you he was not viewed that way in the African world. And that points up another factor, which is that just like there can be splits within the working class, the aforementioned split with regard to the posture towards the War of 1812, there can be splits amongst minorities as well. I'm thinking of the Jewish minority in the United States of America, which understandably has been touted as a kind of ally amongst those defined as white during the anti-Jim Crow movement. But this has not necessarily been a steady and consistent ally. For example, Mordecai Noah, who was probably the most celebrated Jewish American in the antebellum period, was a stout and firm defender of Christians who were enslaved in North Africa, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, which of course led to US conflict in North Africa. But he was also a firm and stout defender of enslavement of Africans in North America, to the point where Freedom's Journal, the leading Black periodical of the 1820s, headquartered in Manhattan, said that, quote, Mordecai Noah was the, quote, bitterest enemy, unquote, of Black people. And so given all of these conflicts and contradictions, it's understandable why many of us have felt it necessary to rely upon global allies and global forces, which brings us to the other point, which is that we can't just rely upon historical examples or general principles. We have to keep up with the news. And that's what we're trying to do here, because in this fast-moving world, things can change. That's one of the reasons why we study history. History is oftentimes defined as the study of change over time. And we cannot ignore change over time if we are serious about transformation. For example, just this week, the US ruling class made a significant ideological concession. That is to say that Joseph Ellis, a court historian whose research has been backed amply by the Ford Foundation and is a premier apologist for 1776, of course, a Pulitzer Prize winner, needless to say, has just published a book pointing to what he calls, quote, the great contradiction, unquote, between the soaring rhetoric of 1776 and the grimy reality of enhanced enslavement, enhanced indigenous dispossession. Of course, Mr. Ellis does not go as far as the late Tyler Stovall in his book, White Freedom, not to mention going as far as I have in my work. But in some ways, Ellis's book puts him to the left of many people on the US left who continue to be apologists for genocide and mass enslavement that led to the foundation of the United States of America. And of course, that kind of apologia makes them basically incapable of understanding today's struggles, electoral or otherwise, which is one of the many reasons why we bring to you every week this program.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn. First, we want to ask you about the 3-day summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Nearly 24 world leaders descended on the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur for the ASEAN summit, from this past Sunday, October 26th, to Tuesday, October 28th. While the summit was, of course, dominated by the shadow of steep U.S. tariffs, China pressed for open trade and stronger economic ties. On Monday, a day after Trump's 6-hour blitz of meetings and trade announcements at the summit, Chinese Premier Li Qiang called on regional leaders to uphold free trade and oppose protectionism, a phrase China has used to call out Trump's tariffs. Also noteworthy was the news that East Timor has joined ASEAN as the bloc's 11th member state, in a move Prime Minister Xanana Gusmao hailed as a dream realized. Dr. Horne, in addition, we wanted to ask you about the fact that while in Asia, President Trump also visited Japan and is currently in South Korea. Dr. Horne, what is your assessment of the ASEAN summit and President Trump's visits to Japan and South Korea, particularly in the context of the growing crisis of U.S. imperialism and the churning of the global correlation of forces?
Well, it's not surprising that Mr. Trump chose to visit the ASEAN meeting. After all, the heavyweight of ASEAN is Indonesia, which by some measures will be the fourth largest economy on planet Earth by the middle of this century. And of course, Indonesia is the largest predominantly Muslim nation on planet Earth. You might recall that at that meeting in Egypt a few weeks ago, where there was a kind of ratification of this accord that supposedly has led to a ceasefire in historic Palestine, the leader of Indonesia was caught on a hot mic, basically trying to arrange a meeting with Mr. Trump's sons, Don Jr. and Eric, presumably for reasons of graft and corruption. And I dare say that that kind of graft and corruption was also part of Mr. Trump's agenda at this ASEAN meeting. But on the other hand, on the sidelines of this meeting, which was also attended by President Ramaphosa of South Africa, President Lula of Brazil also showed up, and he had a meeting with Mr. Trump, which was quite extraordinary given the rather inflamed rhetoric that Mr. Trump has been hurling at Brazil, including celebrating the Trump of the tropics, speaking of Mr. Bolsonaro, who is slated to spend hard time in prison sooner rather than later because of his attempt to execute a coup d'etat, making sure that Mr. Lula did not resume office. I should also say that the Republic of Korea is quite vulnerable right now because China is looking like a hawk at their deals with the United States of America and is ready to pounce if Seoul makes the wrong move. And likewise, we should not see it as some sort of blitheful maneuver that Mr. Trump is seeking meetings with Chairman Kim of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I would imagine that this has a lot to do with putting pressure on Seoul, not to mention, as Mr. Trump might see it, putting pressure on Beijing as well. And I would also add that Seoul, at least the population of South Korea, remains understandably and justifiably upset with what befell Koreans and their comrades in the state of Georgia, USA, just a few weeks ago, when ICE agents raided their attempt to build a facility, part of this capital investment that Mr. Trump is always championing. And that led to the detention of Seoul and South Korean workers and executives in very harsh and draconian conditions. That has not gone down very well in South Korea, needless to say. So Mr. Trump had some fence mending to do. With regard to the trip to Japan, this is all about the anti-China alliance. As we have noted before, the former heavy metal drummer, now Prime Minister Takaichi, is an anti-China hawk. She apparently got on well with Mr. Trump because of that basis, because of that reason. However, it's going to be very difficult for Tokyo to come up with what Mr. Trump has been marking. That is to say, $550 billion of investment from Japan into the United States of America, more than $500 billion, which by some measures is more than the revenue that Tokyo takes in, which means that corporations like Toyota will be on the hook for this kind of investment. And given the fact that we are told repeatedly that free markets should reign globally, it's not going to be easy for the government to twist the arm of Japanese corporations to get them to cough up $550 billion for the United States of America, particularly given all of the domestic problems that Japan is now enduring. So once again, with regard to Mr. Trump, we have to look at the rhetoric, but more than that, we have to study the actions.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about an article from the New York Times from October 23rd, entitled Silicon Valley Has China Envy, and that reveals a lot about America. The New York Times article goes on to state that, quote, suddenly, Chinese firms once dismissed as copycats are being studied for lessons on efficiency and scale. China's top-down, state-led system is being reframed not as a political liability, but as a model of efficiency and execution. Dr. Horne, while you and others have been saying for at least the past 5 years what the New York Times and Silicon Valley just seem to be figuring out, what is your reaction to this article? And is it fair to say that the New York Times and Silicon Valley have essentially conceded the fact that socialist planning is actually quite an effective model?
Well, there's planning in the United States of America as well, but it's helter-skelter. It's not necessarily centrally coordinated. When in past years, the National Institutes of Health have chosen to pass out money to this researcher rather than that researcher, that reflects a government-coordinated central planning. However, I would point the audience to an article on the New York Times website by their columnist Nicholas Kristof, which points out accurately, I think, that the United States is losing this trade war to China. To put it in simple terms, the United States is suffering. That is to say, farmers in the Midwest in particular are suffering because China has stopped buying billions of dollars in soybeans. Interestingly enough, the United States has engineered a bailout for Argentina, whose farmers are now taking those markets that Midwestern farmers used to enjoy, not to mention Brazilian farmers and agriculturalists being able to take those markets that U.S. agriculturalists used to enjoy. At the same time that China can buy soybeans from other sources, the United States cannot necessarily buy rare earth minerals from other sources. That is to say, these are not rare, as we pointed out repeatedly, but the refining and processing is unique and is part of the anti-Soviet scheme that was engineered in the 1970s. The United States offloaded a good deal of that refining and processing to China. And with now China cracking down and limiting the export of rare earth minerals, not only to the United States, but worldwide, and these minerals are necessary for smartphones, for automobiles, for warfare, fighter planes, etc., the United States has to crawl to the bargaining table, which it's doing tomorrow in Seoul, South Korea, where President Xi Jinping of China has the leverage. And this may mark a significant moment in a 500-year-long struggle against the hegemony of the North Atlantic nations, not to mention white supremacy, which brings us to the underlying reason for this debacle, this fiasco, which, as noted, goes back to that 1970s deal on an anti-Soviet basis between Washington and Beijing. Interestingly enough, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon opened the door to this relationship in the early 1970s, but it wasn't until the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter that the door was firmly open to collaboration, not only in terms of finance and economics, but also in terms of dual use technology, which implicated the military. It also points up the contradictions of whiteness, because the engineer of the Carter overtures to China was Zbigniew Brzezinski, national security advisor, coming from a long line of anti-Moscow Polish elites. And it's interesting also to note the Red Scare trimmers. That is to say, the U.S. ambassador in China at the time of these overtures was none other than Leonard Woodcock, a former leader of the United Auto Workers, who was on the winning anti-communist side of internal battles within that once mostly progressive union. And of course, Leonard Woodcock presided over the moving, in general terms, of the industrial plant of his own Michigan to China, for example, which is quite ironic indeed. And then, of course, the ambassador to the United Nations, at least for the early part of the Carter administration, was Andrew Young, a once chief aide to Dr. King. And of course, the pivotal roles played globally by Woodcock and Young was a reflection of the Red Scare, was a reflection of the fact that, for example, another chief aide to Dr. King, speaking of the late Jack Odell, who had Communist Party ties, was routed at the behest of the White House, leaving Dr. King in a very difficult position, having not being able to rely upon his wise counsel. And so, once again, in order to understand the current moment, this present dilemma that we now face, where China is ahead in green energy, ahead in quantum computing, likely ahead in artificial intelligence, the technology of the future. Recall what we talked about with regard to DeepSeek, the AI firm from China, and how spending a pittance compared to the billions, if not trillions, spent in this country, in some ways has a head start with regard to AI. And Mr. Trump and the wing of the US ruling class that he represents may have been able to overcome all of these barriers with the united front amongst the leading capitalist countries. But let me point you to a current poll from Canada, which suggests that Canadians fear the United States more than they fear China, which is understandable because unlike the United States of America, China is not threatening to annex Canada and make it a province of the United States of America. And we haven't even touched upon what may be the prime issue, which is that the US government is heavily dependent upon the People's Bank in Beijing buying treasury bills, which keeps the government afloat, such as it is, given the government shutdown, which we're about to discuss. And that gives China once more leverage over US imperialism, making it understandable why the New York Times would print this story about envy from Silicon Valley.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about the Irish election. It was reported this past Saturday, October 25th, that the independent candidate Catherine Connolly was elected Ireland's 10th president in a landslide victory, winning 63% of the vote. The Fine Gael candidate Heather Humphreys won less than half that figure, with 29% of the first preference vote, and Fianna Fáil candidate Jim Gavin, who ended his campaign in early October, but whose name remained on the ballot paper, took 7% of the vote, the party's worst ever performance. Turnout was higher than expected at 46%, exceeding the 2018 presidential election. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of the results of the Irish election and the victory of Catherine Connolly?
Well, first of all, breaking news. According to recent reports, with regard to the recently concluded Dutch elections, the center-left forces have prevailed, wounding severely the far-right forces under Geert Wilders, which had done well in the previous election. This is good news, and it may indicate a growing and coming trend in Europe. I should also point out the recent election or by-election in Wales, which, as you know, is part of the United Kingdom. The Labour Party, historically, for decades, has been relying upon victories in Wales to pad their majority or their electoral results in Parliament. But a center-left party in Wales, which, like similar forces in Scotland, bids fair to engage in a movement towards independence, meaning a breakup of the United Kingdom, also managed to prevail, and left sprawling in the dust were the Tories, which the Conservatives, who obviously do not have bright fortunes ahead of them. Now, with regard to Ireland, this is significant for a number of reasons. Number one, recall the historic close ties between Ireland and Spain, going back centuries to their common Catholicism and their common antagonism to Protestant London. Indeed, as I point out in my 1776 book, if you look at the ethnicity of some of the Spanish leaders in North America during the time when Spain had a toehold here, they were actually of Irish descent, for example. And today, as we pointed out more than once, some of the strongest anti-Trump sentiment within the European Union comes precisely from the socialist government in Spain. And we should also keep a watch on whether or not, although I must confess, I tend to doubt it, whether or not this positive left-leaning victory in Ireland will have knock-on effects amongst the Irish American community. Once again, that may be overly optimistic, but at the same time, it's something that is worthy of considering.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about several related issues on the domestic front. First, the federal government shutdown continues without an end in sight. In just a few days, tens of millions of people are at risk of losing federal food and nutrition benefits as a result. This includes the nearly 42 million people who rely on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, previously known as food stamps. The Trump administration has warned that the debit-like EBT cards will not be refilled and that the program will run out of money on November 1st. SNAP, the country's largest anti-hunger program, dates back to the Great Depression and has never been disrupted this way. Most recipients are seniors, families with children, and people with disabilities. And on October 25th, it was reported that the mystery donor, whose $130 million contribution is meant to pay U.S. military troops during the government shutdown, is Timothy Mellon, an heir to a renowned Gilded Age banking family. And in the midst of this government shutdown, where President Trump is forcing to 42 million people in the U.S. into hunger, he shamefully decided that now is a good time to add a 90,000 square foot ballroom to the White House. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of all of this news? And what is your response to the position from some of our friends on the left who claim that cutting off food stamps may be just the thing that gets Trump supporters, particularly working-class white folk, to turn against President Trump?
Well, worse the better rarely works out in practice. Worse usually leads to worse, not better. And in any case, I would suggest that those friends of ours on the left pay attention to how we opened this program, with the remark about the class collaborationism that inheres in settler colonialism. That is to say, we are in the midst of a counter-revolutionary moment, which is not unusual for this country. Recall what followed the U.S. Civil War, with the rise of Reconstruction and democratic promise that was rapidly drowned in blood by racist terror spearheaded by the Ku Klux Klan, when there was an attempt to disenfranchise, to take away the vote of Black men in that particular section of the United States of America. The not so hidden agenda by the elite was also to strip many poor Euro-Americans of the vote too, which of course proceeded in Dixie. And I'm afraid to say that because of the aforementioned anti-Blackness, many of these Euro-American settler descendants did not stridently or necessarily object to the fact that they were being penalized under the guise of stripping Negroes of the right to vote. And I should also mention something else with regard to this rise of fascist-like tendencies. And this is something that has been a headline on this program for weeks now. That is to say that the Red Scare of the 1950s has led inevitably to the Blue Scare of 2025, where Tish James, the Black woman Attorney General of New York State, finds herself on trial in Virginia on basically trumped up charges, pardon the expression. What I'm saying is that once you throw a stalwart like Paul Robeson overboard, as the liberals and the NAACP stand up and applaud, it becomes inevitable that the right wing will be strengthened and that it leads inexorably to the Blue Scare. That is to say, the Red Scare flows ineluctably into the Blue Scare. One more point. First of all, pay close attention to the upcoming New York City mayor's election. That'll be a telling sign one way or another. And finally, pay attention to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. You recall this quote from the German cleric Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the communists, but I was not a communist and I did not object. And then they came for the socialists and I was not a socialist, blah, blah, blah. Well, interestingly, in the Holocaust Museum, they stripped away the first part. First, they came for the communists. I guess that's a signal that perhaps they should come for the communists. And of course, they're not imbibing the lesson of Martin Niemöller, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.